comprehensive immigration reform is likely a bipartisan issue. And if everyone can just sort of take a step back, look at this globally, recognize that immigration is a net positive, I think that there is a path forward.
Since spring 2022, over 130,000 migrants have arrived in New York City.
So you could say we have a border crisis, but we also have an asylum crisis, because it is the promise of asylum that is drawing people to the country.
This unexpected influx has stretched local resources thin, and Mayor Eric Adams has sounded the alarm, calling it a humanitarian crisis. But how did we get here?
We did not have this kind of visible crisis in our city until it was driven by a political motive.
And we're all sort of facing the same challenges, right? We want to have the biggest and widest open hearts and welcome as many folks as we can, but there are real constraints on what we can do.
And can New York and the United States continue to be a sanctuary for those seeking opportunity, while also being fiscally responsible?
But fundamentally, what we need are the resources to be able to care for everyone that's here, right? We want to do as much as we can, but unfortunately, our resources are finite.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020 and part 2 of our migration mini-series. Today, the drivers, challenges, and solutions of New York City's migration crisis. Today, we were joined by Camille Joseph Varlack, Muzaffar Chishti, and Nancy Foner. Camille Joseph Varlack is Chief of Staff to Mayor Eric Adams of New York City. Muzaffar Chishti is Senior Fellow at the Migration Policy Institute and Director of MPI's office at New York University School of Law. Professor Nancy Foner is Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center at City University of New York. Moderating the discussion is Courtney Doggart, President of Network 2020.
This story, this situation that we are exploring today, it's not just a domestic or local one, though it might seem so on the surface. Those who follow U.S. domestic politics are well aware that what happens at the U.S. southern border is now being tied to aid in Ukraine. So there are immediate foreign policy ramifications. And on a more macro level, a number of global trends are influencing migration patterns. The after effects of COVID-19 in lesser developed countries that did not have the income support structures that wealthier countries had means that 50 million more people were pushed into income poverty in 2020. Rising prices brought about by the war in Ukraine. Climate change causing higher impact weather events. And in this century, 98% of demographic growth will take place in lesser developed countries, while the remaining nations face aging, shrinking populations. So it is imperative that we not only understand and address the underlying causes of immigration when appropriate, but that we as societies realize that tackling the migration crisis in a humane and fiscally prudent way requires developing smart policies that are responsive to those big picture trends so that we can strengthen rather than divide societies. And so with that, I am so pleased that we have 3 terrific guests today who can really help us look at what smart policies might be for New York and the United States. Camille, starting with you. In his recent State of the City address, Mayor Eric Adams spoke about the 172,000 asylum seekers that the city has helped, including the 105,000 that have gone on the path to self-sufficiency. Yet the influx of asylum seekers is largely called a crisis. Can you please set the stage for us? What is the scope of the crisis for the city? What are the biggest challenges, particularly when it comes to setting migrants onto this path of self-sufficiency?
Sure, absolutely. And first of all, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here and talking about this topic that certainly is one of the biggest issues facing the administration and that we are working on every day. And to your point, while it's a crisis, as we think about us as being part of sort of a global society, we do recognize that this is going to be ongoing, right? The migration waves that are happening in the United States right now, it is not the only migration that is happening. People are moving all over the world for all sorts of reasons. Focusing very specifically on New York City, it's been about 2 years since the first bus of asylum seekers came to New York City. I think it was March of 2020. 22 when the first bus came. As you noted, we cared for over 172,400 people. We've submitted approximately 30,000 asylum seeker work authorization and TPS applications from a site that's pretty much was created from scratch, and have helped approximately 100,000 asylum seekers sort of move on to their next steps. But this has impacted all of our city services, right? It is an unexpected situation that we have been facing. I think we take an incredible amount of pride in the work that we have done, and we have had tons of individuals from both the federal government, other governments, nonprofits, as many places you could possibly think of, CBOs that have come in to take a look at the work that we have done, and for the most part have been incredibly supportive of the work that we have done, and we take a lot of pride in that. We have a shelter system that serves sort of traditional New Yorkers that took us decades to build. We had approximately 20 months to build the system for where we are right now, and it has doubled our capacity in the city. We've opened up over 212 emergency shelters in a very short period of time, in addition to humanitarian rescue and respite centers. And so while we internally are very focused on moving from a crisis state to a steady state, because we know that while there will be ebbs and flows, I think at a peak, we've received in excess of 4,000 individuals a week. We know we have to make those shifts, and so that's what we've been doing. And so helping the asylum seekers, as we frequently refer to them, our new New Yorkers, get on the path to self-sufficiency, that is our top priority. We think a lot of that is really rooted in their ability to work and provide for themselves. We've had the opportunity to speak with many of them, both here as well as down at the border, and they all sort of resoundingly say, we want the ability to work, to provide for ourselves, to provide for our families. So continuing to advocate for that and think creatively about how we can create those pathways or help them with those pathways is important. And also focusing on intensive case management, as well as our application help center, which has been really incredible to see all the work that has been done and our ability to file those 30,000 applications.
Thank you so much for that overview. Really appreciate it. Muz, turning to you, how would you describe this current migration crisis, and what would you like to see from the current asylum processing system?
Well, I think Camille laid it out well, the nature of the crisis that has faced New York City. But it's a global crisis, and particularly hit the United States hugely in the last 3 years. And those 3 years have coincided with the Biden administration. So unfortunately, the Biden administration has been confronted with a crisis that it was not prepared for. And we have challenge at the border, and the nature of the challenge has radically changed even in the last 5 or 6 years, to be very clear. We have today laws, regulations, resources, staffing for an era of border challenge, which is no longer true. Like even 5, 6 years ago, the border challenge was single Mexican men sort of clandestinely trying to enter the US looking for a job. Now, no element of that description today is valid. We have more and more families are coming, more and more non-Mexicans are coming, and they're not clandestinely coming in. They're coming to the border seeking asylum, which then creates a whole different challenge of the asylum system. So you could say we have a border crisis, but we also have an asylum crisis, because it is the promise of asylum that is drawing people to the country. And that has now reached unprecedented numbers. In our present asylum system, anyone who is admitted at the border is sent for a hearing before an immigration court system. That court system already has like close to 3 million cases in the backlog. So if these cases are sent to that backlog system, they won't even hear their first hearing probably for 6 to 7 years. And during that time, people get work authorized and people have no fear of being removed. So that has become a magnet in itself, which has two distinct problems. One is that it actually doesn't give people who truly deserve our asylum under asylum law, asylum quickly enough. And it helps people to clog the arteries of asylum who are not eligible for asylum. So what we need to do is have a reform of our asylum system where cases can be determined very efficiently and fairly. We at the Migration Policy Institute have argued that the elements of that is not to send new border cases to the courts, but send them to asylum officers within the U.S. Immigration and Customs Service, Citizenship Service, because these are asylum officers who are country experts. These cases can be determined in months as against years, and so that people actually have an outcome in a reasonable period of time. I think if we manage to get there, we will create a dent, which would then send a message in social medias, which, by the way, is now hugely important for the way people are drive to the themselves to the border. That look, if you're going to come to the U.S., you're not guaranteed to live here with work authorization for years, and you're going to get an asylum hearing quickly. I think it's that unchecked sort of flows at the border, which then would stay here for years, which created the special challenge for New York City. And New York City, let me say, is unique in this world on providing universal right to shelter. That itself then became a magnet. So we're confronted with two magnets of a crisis, and that's what we are dealing with them simultaneously in our own city.
So, brief follow-up, do you see any willingness, or what is it that you're seeing on the federal level in terms of enacting asylum reforms along the lines of what you're saying?
So I think federal government, to be completely nonpartisan on this, I think took this challenge on a little too late, seriously. I mean, the president did not use the word crisis till last week. Last Friday is the first time he has used the word crisis. While we had to declare it a crisis many months ago, if not a couple of years ago, to be in a crisis mode. I mean, how can you be in a crisis mode if you don't acknowledge there is a crisis? It's as simple as that. I think now we are in the middle of a possible bipartisan breakthrough of a border security bill in the Senate, that both Republicans and Democrats realize that, look, we just can't accept the status quo. Something has to change. So we don't know, none of us have seen the text of the bill, but as you pointed out in introduction, we now have a border security bill, one of the most contentious domestic policy issues, tied with one of the most important foreign policy issues, which is aid to Ukraine. And you can see how hard that is. But the idea was, as Dodgers and DC, if you want anything happen, make it bigger. So people try to make it bigger by tying these two things. And the idea would be to have a different standard of screening people at the border so that fewer people meet the criteria to be admitted in to process their asylum claims. There also is a significant effort to increase detention beds, because only since we don't have enough detention beds, that people are let into the country. And there's a lot of emphasis in trying to reduce the authority of the president to grant parole. Parole is a peculiar element of our law under which the executive has the authority to let people in. And 1 million people have been let on parole under the Biden administration. Congress seems to be sort of skeptical about the use of group classification for paroles as against individual classification. They're troubled that all Cubans or all the Venezuelans should be. So there is some tendency to restrict group classification on parole.
Thank you for that clarification. Nancy, we at Network 2020, we're big on context, and I think historical context is a very good thing to bring into this conversation. So how does this current inflow compare to historical inflows, and what makes it different?
Yeah, we come back to New York City. New York City has, of course, always been an immigrant city. Currently, there's 36% of New Yorkers are foreign born or immigrant, but that's actually lower than it was in 1910 when it was 41%. So actually in my remarks, I want to just start by going back a little further to what I often call the last great wave of immigration between about 1880 and 1920, and look at some of the differences, okay? And that was a huge immigration to New York, virtually all Europeans and mainly Jews from Eastern Europe and Italians from Southern Italy. And if we go back, the legal context was just completely different, okay? There were no numerical limits on immigration at that time between 1880 and 1910. You didn't need a visa to come to the United States to live and work, and that didn't get instituted until the 1920s. Before World War II, there was no such thing, a legal thing such as asylum. And of course, there was no right to shelter law, but actually even in New York, not till 1981. So 100 years ago, hardly any immigrants in New York were undocumented. They were screened before they came. The big thing was getting on the boat in Europe. They were screened mainly for disease. And when they got to Ellis Island and landed at Ellis Island, only 2% of all those who came to Ellis Island were turned away. So there were very few, hardly any undocumented immigrants. And of course, there were no asylee seekers. That would have been something. But I want to come back and just say one more thing at this point about the numbers, because I know we're talking about these unprecedented numbers and, we've never seen anything like this before. But I think we do need to put this into context. And here I'm not just talking about 1880 to 1920. I'm talking about the post-1965 period and, the last few decades. New York City has received, has been in the midst of a very heavy wave of immigration for the last 40 years or so. And if we look back, say, to the 1990s, over 100,000 immigrants were coming into the city every year in the early 1990s. And we do have 3.1 million immigrants in New York. So I do think, when there are issues today, obviously, we've heard from both Camille and from Moose, but I think we do need to put this in perspective that the city does have a huge immigrant population. And people are coming to New York, by the way, not just as asylum seekers, but with green cards too. I mean, there are immigrants still arriving with green cards. New York still has an appeal to many immigrants. So I think we do need to, that's, just a different perspective a little bit, just to put this in the larger context of immigration.
And I think if I can just respond to that point, I think it's a great one. And thank you, Nancy, for the lesson, because I think it's important to ground this all. I do want to note that you are absolutely right in terms of the incredible diversity of New York City, and which I personally think is its strength, right? And certainly I'm very aware of the immigration, the global immigration that has happened in New York City throughout its entire history. I myself am an immigrant. I came here from Trinidad and Tobago as a child. And while I lived in Rochester, New York for a long time, I couldn't wait to get to New York City because I knew about its diversity. I knew and appreciated the unique characteristics of this city because it is built by immigrants and is largely populated by folks that came from different places. So I think what the distinction that I really want to focus on is, 4,000 folks a week and a governor that is very deliberately sending people here to make a larger point. I think that is a distinction that is worth noting.
Camille, just sticking with you and broadening it out a little bit. I understand the city has done a lot of homework in trying to understand how other jurisdictions have grappled with inflows of asylum seekers and migrants. Can you just talk a little bit about what the city has learned from its due diligence, how New York is working with other global cities, and really how we need to engage with the international community to address this crisis?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, through our office of Mayor's Office of Immigrant International Affairs, we certainly have reached out to numerous cities, including Hamburg, Amsterdam, and Berlin, that have histories of successfully integrating large waves of refugees. A lot of them, I think, around 2015. And just to understand sort of best practices, what have they done, and to explore creative solutions for housing. And so a lot of the learnings that came from those conversations helped to shape some of the things that we considered as we designed our own system. here as we've been going through this. We've also been talking to global migration experts, leaders of NGOs, nonprofits, both internationally, nationally, as well as locally. We've certainly looked at our own absorption of thousands of Ukrainian immigrants that have come here and can sort of compared it to the current population. I think one of the biggest distinctions being they had the ability to work, and that certainly made it much easier to integrate them, not just into New York City, but also to New York State. I think in addition to that, and I think as is known, the mayor is one that really wants to be on the ground. He's very much an on-the-ground mayor. And so I traveled with him to El Paso to see what was happening. We went to the border. We had lots of conversations with Customs and Border Patrol, right, to understand what they have been dealing with. And, I think one of the great things about him is that he calls out, it may not be fair to New York, but it's also not fair to the border towns that absorb the waves of folks that come in on a daily basis. Our team has also traveled to the U.S.-Mexico border, which I just referenced in 2022, not just with the mayor, but other members of the team went down there as well. And then he also went to Mexico City last year. He went to Mexico, he went to the Darien Gap in Colombia in October, had the opportunity to speak to individuals that were there, individuals that were getting ready to go into the Darien Gap, to really understand sort of the root causes of where we are, what they were fleeing, why they were coming to the United States, to understand what their perceptions were of what they would find when they arrived here. And I think the third component of it is just talking to our fellow big cities about what is happening and how it's impacting them. I think there's been recent news stories about Chicago and Denver in particular, as well as, of course, Massachusetts. And we're all sort of facing the same challenges, right? We want to have the biggest and widest open hearts and welcome as many folks as we can, but there are real constraints on what we can do, particularly when there isn't a national decompression strategy and when we don't always have the resources to care for folks in the way that we would want to.
Perfect. Thank you for letting us in on all that. Muz, turning a little, you talked a little bit about asylum before. I'd like to switch gears and talk about work. Work is obviously, it comes up several times. We've mentioned it over and over again. Eric Adams mentioned it in his State of the City. Governor Kathy Hochul has announced 18,000 jobs that could be filled by migrants with work permits. With this being such an elemental piece of this puzzle, even if the asylum process were to be solved, what are some of the structural challenges and opportunities that you see within the overall labor market?
Courtney, I'm too very delighted to touch, but can I just take 1 minute to talk about politics? Because you just cannot escape the role of politics in this. First, I hope no one gets an impression from this that I or anyone else on this panel thinks that we should abandon our commitment to asylum or abandon our commitment to universal right to shelter. These are two defining value-driven elements of our policy, and they should be preserved. We are founded on the principle of asylum. We have to be leaders in the world to tell other countries that their commitment to asylum has to stay intact. Same is true for universal right to shelter. We should be proud of it. I mean, I have been educated in the fact that we don't have homelessness crisis in our city like San Francisco or LA or DC because of the right to shelter. So we really cannot abandon it. These are rights and sort of values that have to be strengthened. They don't have to be abandoned. So we have to mend them to make sure that we don't end them. And that's sort of what I think the reforms that we all have to be focused on. Governor Abbott made it a political stunt to send people to New York City. We did not have this kind of visible crisis in our city until it was driven by a political motive of a governor to make that. So we have to be aware of that. And even the congressional action that I talked about earlier, today members of Congress are busy not supporting a bill that would address this crisis because they would rather have an issue going into the election as against an outcome. So all that politics is important. On your point, I like to say that we have two crises in immigration, and they're really intricately linked. One is we actually do have need for labor migration. We have a We have a population crisis. We have no net growth of population native. We have demand for workers, especially at the lower end of a wage scale and middle end. And we don't have legal channels for letting people in. In fact, to be blunt, the only way, other than through family unification, if you want to come to the country for employment-based immigration, it's high-end computer occupations. There are no other. So that just doesn't make sense. So we have argued at the Migration Policy Institute that we have to adopt a new bridge visa, which sort of bridges occupations from low skills to high skills and bridges temporary workers to permanent workers. We kind of make a mockery of saying that people are coming for temporary work. Well, we know they're coming for long-term absorption in the labor market, and our present law doesn't allow that. We think we should allow people on the basis of employer sponsorship to come for periods of 3 years, and then at the end of 3 years, they can extend it by 3 more years, but they could also have the option of returning back to their countries and coming from a different visa, 3-month, 3-year bridges that later on, so that we can encourage even circular migration. We think that increasingly large number of people do not want to live in the US for the rest of their lives, but they want to work legally and be able to travel. The bridge visa would accomplish that. And the number for that should be determined by an independent commission, not by politicians, like we do with Federal Reserve does it for interest rates. We haven't changed our level of immigration for the last 35 years. We change interest rates every quarter. So that doesn't make sense even to a Trump supporter. So if we have a flexible system, which tells you what the need of the economy is, that becomes the number for the next 2 years. And if we introduce circularity, I think the combination of the two will meet the demand. And the reason Congress is not doing it is because of the border crisis, that they are at least able to point out that, look, whether they mean it or not, that till you fix the border, we can't move on legal immigration. That's why these are twin crises and they're linked.
Thank you for that helpful summary. Nancy, in this first part of the mini-series, when we looked at root causes of migration from the Northern Triangle, the importance of connections came up. Could you please talk about the role of networks in the current crisis? How are connections playing a role, and does this differ from what you've seen historically?
Well, let me just, yes, network connections. Let me deal with the similarities, because network connections have always been critical for migrants coming to the US or to New York City in finding housing and finding jobs. In fact, in coming here in the first place. Often immigrants come to New York precisely because they have relatives and friends and ethnic communities that are here. Relatives often send money home to enable them to come. So that's always, that's nothing new. And linking this up to the job market, immigrants often, and certainly new arrivals, often use network connections, particularly to relatives, also as often friends, to get jobs. Often because they don't speak English or don't speak English well, although that's today, many immigrants come with English, but many don't. And often because they lack information about or ties to the broader labor market. What's interesting and is often discussed in the literature is, well, we understand why immigrants want to use their ties to get jobs, but why do employers often prefer it? And we're talking about private employers. And because one, it's cheaper than advertising or going through agencies, but also because employers find it more reliable to ask if they have an opening or openings, to ask existing employees to recommend people for the job, because they feel that those they're going to recommend somebody who's going to work out. Because if they recommend somebody who doesn't work out, the employer isn't going to go back to them again. And also because employers who sponsor relatives employees who sponsor relatives often provide informal training on the job. So those are things that have been true for a long time. But they're a difference today. In earlier historical periods, and even before the migrant crisis, most new arrivals to New York City headed for ethnic enclaves or ethnic communities that had developed, because in fact, that's often why they picked New York in the first place to come to. because but I should also add that in addition to having relatives and friends there who could put them up and to help them get jobs, also there are institutions in these communities that could help them too, particularly religious institutions, churches, temples, mosques. But today, many of the newest migrants seeking asylum are from countries like Venezuela, and I'm talking here about New York City, and another top country that I found out about just the other day, in Mauritania. There are no sizable ethnic communities in New York, at least not yet, for those groups. And so the recent asylum seekers also didn't pick New York. They were bused from Texas, right? They were bused here. So they often lack close relatives or close ethnic, people from their communities back home. And so they're more dependent on government help for housing and getting work. So I think and I think we also need to think that those who were bused here and who come to New York and who are often having difficulties, adjusting, getting jobs, housing, may end up leaving to go to other places. We know just because immigrants come to one place, even if they come there to settle, I mean, we just heard Camille say she went to Rochester and then came to New York City. But it could happen the other way around, although I don't know about Rochester in particular. But many of those who are bused here may end up, as migrants do, leaving and going somewhere else. I mean, migration, if we look from a demographic perspective, is a churning. People come here and they leave. And some go, I would certainly think many Venezuelans might want to go, for example, to Florida, where there are Venezuelan communities, or, I mean, we don't really know, but that's also a dynamic. And just before I end, because I just want to go back to a different issue, just to emphasize something that Muz said about the need for workers. I think we can see immigration, whatever types and varieties that will be true in the future. There is going to be a continued demand for immigration in this country because of the demographics, the aging of the baby boomers. The baby boomers by 2030 will all be over 65. They are a huge cohort, right? They're not going to be there are going to be job openings. And also we have falling fertility rates in this country. So between those two, there's going to be demand for workers at actually all levels, including, at the lower levels. And, as the population ages, there's going to be a demand for people to care for the elderly. I mean, that's another issue. So I think that we have to factor that in too, in terms of looking at immigration.
Thank you. 100%. It's almost like the insertion of politics seems like we're just shooting ourselves in the foot here. We're getting a few questions about the makeup of people and protections. And so I'm going to put this in a two-part. So I'll first go to Camille and then to you, Nancy. And so I'd love just to hear your response, Camille, to what the city is doing, particularly for women and children, and whether or not people are susceptible to the black market. Someone's mentioning the migrant children selling candy on the subway during school hours. So curious to hear the administration's response to that. And Nancy, if you wouldn't mind talking after a little bit about how when more women are coming in, when in the past it was mostly single men, this questioner asks, what are some of the unique challenges they face and what can the government do to support them, and sort of contextualizing that for us, please. Camille.
Sure. I think certainly from my part, we are incredibly focused on women and children and particularly concerned. And that not only comes from the traditional vulnerability, but also, and going back to my earlier statements about what the mayor certainly learned, what we all learned, and about what happens when you go through the Darien Gap, there's an incredible amount of trauma in this population because of what they've gone through, because of what they're dealing with. The rates of sexual assault that happen in the Darien Gap are incredibly high, and so there's several things that we are sort of focused on. So one, in terms of kids, really connecting them to school, which helps to build community as quickly as possible. And I am incredibly grateful to New York City Public Schools, and I've had the opportunity to speak to lots of New Yorkers who were also very concerned about the 60-day limits. because they had created such an amazing community for the children, for the asylum seeker children that they had absorbed, and they really want them to stay, right? They want to continue those efforts. We have absorbed, I think, in excess of 30,000 students into New York City public schools. It's really unbelievable, and there's so many parents and professionals that have stepped up to take care of them. So there's certainly that. We have at our legal assistance clinic, as well as in many of our facilities, staff to help to deal with the trauma. So social workers, psychologists, if we have them on staff, to be there. You know, the average application at the legal assistance clinic takes about 4 hours. And it's not just because of the complexity of the story. A lot of times it's because both the applicant and the person filling out the application on their behalf are incredibly overwhelmed by the stories and what they're hearing. And it just becomes challenging to move through that work. So we are very focused on it. We want to make sure that we continue to provide the additional supports for the population. That's why, as an example, families with children have a 60-day limit, not a 30-day limit. More robust case management to make sure that we are focused on that as well. And I think we will continue to focus on the issues that are particular to the women and children and families that are in our care.
Actually, in terms of the whole migration to New York or to the US, and women are a very high percentage, and from some countries, more women are coming than men. I mean, so it's not like we don't have many. I don't know the ratio among these asylum seekers coming to New York City, but if you look at the figures on many groups, there are more women than men here, from immigrants. For women, I mean, obviously the issue of sexual harassment or rape on the journey, but also the degree to which women are being separated from their children, because typically often they don't bring their children with them because they may, I mean, in the past, I don't know what's going on now, but there is a large literature, I should say, in the social sciences on migrant women coming, often leaving their children behind. Because it's dangerous often to bring them across the border. And then there are these long separations that they have with their children, which interestingly are much harder for women. Well, maybe not interestingly, maybe you would expect this, are much harder for women being separated from their children than the men. And interestingly, there was a study of Mexican undocumented immigrants, and the men felt that they were fulfilling their job and duties as husbands and fathers by earning money and sending it back. But the women who came and were separated from their children felt that they were not being good mothers. And the children, in fact, often emphasized that in their conversations with their mothers. And so I think this is very difficult for many women and for many children. The process of reunification with parents after being separated for many years is also difficult. And this has happened before. I assume it's going to be part of the process today also with those who are coming. I think if we look at something optimistic, but to end on a somewhat optimistic note about both families, I mean, one of the conclusions from a lot of migration research is that the children of immigrants, and here we're looking at the children of immigrants who come here and are educated here, are doing better than their parents, overwhelmingly. That it's a happy story in a way. And we should also emphasize that their parents, whether they're coming, asylees, or they're taking an enormous. I always think of them actually as being sort of heroes in many ways, right? Immigrants are ambitious. They're willing to leave their countries, right, and come somewhere else in really difficult circumstances to provide a better life for their families and their children. And they want their children to do well. And many of them do well. I mean, I think and New York City, to plug New York City, is a welcoming place in that respect, not just in terms of its elementary school to high school, but I have to put in a plug here for the institution with which I teach, which is the City University of New York, which has 250,000 students, unlike any city in the country. It's overwhelmingly immigrants and children of immigrants who are the students there. And this is a gateway to mobility. They can live at home. They don't have to, tuition is fairly low. They can work while they're in school. So I guess from a point, again, looking from a mother's point of view, but also from a father's point of view, in this sense, coming to New York, is a step. There, we can look to the future, I guess. I'm saying, these people are coming. They need to get jobs, obviously. They need to get housing. New York is a very expensive city in which to get housing. But, if once they settle, which many of them are going to do, right? Although many of them are going to be undocumented, and that's another issue, right? Because they're not going to get legalized. They're not. There's a very small percentage of those who seek asylum actually get asylum. Okay, and the question is, will they go back or will they stay in an undocumented state? So I mean, that's another issue, right, to raise. But
it's a great point that this is, maybe it's a crisis in the short term, but if you broaden that lens and you look generationally, it really is.
And Courtney, if I might, just on the optimistic note that Nancy mentioned, which I think is a great thing to lean into. In addition to the things that I talked about before, I do want to be clear. Education, we are fully aware, not just because of this particular moment that we are in, but also because we have undocumented folks in New York City and certainly in our shelter system, labor exploitation, sexual trafficking, all of those things are things that we know that this population is primed to get pulled into. To Nancy's point, the vast majority of folks that are in our care are families with children. So it's a very high population of women. And so we also make sure that we do lots of education around those issues. We try to come up with additional activities. Shout out to the Girl Scouts who have something here. I'm not sure if many people would be aware, but they have something called Troop 6000, which is this incredible group of Girl Scouts that are only in homeless shelters. And they are incredible young people that we get to have conversations with, and they get to participate in all of those activities. So those things are there, but we are fully aware of all of the concerns. I think that's one of the reasons that we call on the federal government to sort of finish the job. You have a lot of people that come here and they're not here illegally. That many of them have gone through a process. They have been paroled into the US. And then because they don't have work authorization, they end up plugging into the illegal job market. And so we're aware of that, and we just want to make sure they have the right at least to work.
Camille, are there ways for people in New York to volunteer and get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a website for the Office of Asylum Seeker Operations, and there are opportunities there to either send an email if you have a specific request, or to learn how you can help out even more. And then, of course, there's New York City Service, which is the arm of New York City government that focuses on both creating opportunities for us to volunteer outwardly, but also to come in. And so I think the website has been dropped in the chat for anyone who is interested.
Thank you. Final question, sort of our lightning round. I'll go around each of you, Muz, Nancy, Camille. If you could see one thing happen in this next year, what would you most want to see to help alleviate the current crisis, or I guess I shouldn't use crisis, but almost chronic condition?
Well, I hope that Congress finally sees this as a national challenge and as not a political opportunity for grandstanding. It really, I think we have suffered from politicization of this issue, that we are a country that still is wedded to the idea of asylum, wedded to the idea that immigrants really contribute, but it has to be done in an orderly, managed way, that we keep asylum open for people who deserve it, and it doesn't become an incentive for people to try to get here who don't. And I think we can do that by reforming our asylum system. If you ask me what's one thing I would do, you put my, back to the wall, I would say hire 5,000 asylum officers. They will make much more dent in this than anything else than we can do. So simple things like that can make a lot of difference.
Thank you. Nancy?
Oh my gosh. Well, I agree, of course, with everything that Moose says, right? But I think also, Congress hasn't passed an immigration law, right? Has not amended it, right? We're dealing with it since 1990. Among other things, we need to allow more immigrants in legally, more green cards. And I think that's, the number, that would be one step towards relieving some of the pressure to come. And I guess I don't know how we do this, but not have governors in the southern states, right? Like sending immigrants to New York. And also, I think, finally, just mention that I think this notion of a positive view of immigration, both through the country and also the city. I do have to say I was disturbed when the mayor talked about, migrant crisis, possibly destroying, New York. And I think, the political leaders should be also talking and pro-immigrant, not pro-immigrant, but emphasizing the contributions in immigrants. And it's certainly looking at New York, that they've always built New York and have been important to the city. So I would hope for that.
Yeah, I think I would add, in addition to echoing everything that everyone said, because all of those points are incredibly valid. I do think that words matter. And so I think the language that we use around these issues are important. And so again, I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to this audience about how we feel. I think I want folks to know that this is an administration that is full of either immigrants or descendants of immigrants, pretty recent. And so we take this work, it is incredibly personal to us. I think that comprehensive immigration reform is likely a bipartisan issue. And if everyone can just sort of take a step back, look at this globally, recognize, as I think Moo said, that immigration is a net positive, right? And so if we're thoughtful and careful about it, I think that there is a path forward. But as I look forward to the rest of the year, in addition to, of course, hoping that there is some sort of enactment of a tool or levers that we can exercise to help control the flow, certainly we would love a national resettlement strategy or decompression strategy, right? So whether it's folks coming in from the border, or as we are engaged right now in conversations with cities where they say, we've got jobs and we would love to be helpful, and let's create pathways to move folks across the country to places where there's tons of opportunity. We want to be able to do that. But I think the biggest thing that I hope is that we're able to find ways to get more asylum seekers on the path to the ability to legally work, because I think that this is a country that is full of incredible opportunity. We want them to be able to participate in that opportunity. It enriches us all as a society. And so I think that's the thing that would be most impactful on sort of a faster pace.
Thank you. Thank you to each of you for lending your expertise. It was an honor. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. To dive deeper into the global conversation, visit us at network2020.org. See you next time.